title of these, the third of the lectures that I'm giving here at UVU on the 2nd of November, 2018, is entitled Between Worlds, or Enigma in the Fields, Gobeki Tepe. Gobeki is not a household word yet, although it's becoming more well known, and hopefully to all of you, it will become, or at least approach that category of easy familiarity. Now, this is the third of the talks that I'm giving here, and a theme should be emerging. Certainly between the first two, the third will make the theme much clearer. And the theme is a series of firsts. So, last week we looked at what can be read as certainly the earliest known and therefore the first complete cycle of paintings in a cave that I was arguing was in fact the creation through painting and the other activities that went in that cave in southern France, a sacred place, a kind of temple. The week before, the Pantheon is certainly a first. It's the first Enlightenment temple that celebrates the saints of the Enlightenment age, and that's exactly what it remains in France. And today we're going to encounter another couple of firsts, actually more than one. Now, our trajectory is to ultimately return to, and with the experience of what we have encountered in these lectures, have a better understanding of what the classical is. So that's what this image represents. It's from the Museo di Bell'Arte in Vienna, a truly superb room, austere in its own way, that foregrounds the quintessence of the classical, which is the column. And also these lectures, as you know, are part of a larger series that includes Micah's lectures at BYU. The other day I was calling it NYU, but I'm still a transplant from New York. But that part is beginning to fade, mercifully. There are good things about New York, but at least they don't have to deal with the New York public transportation system. The Greek Slave by Hiram Powers, a statue, a very important statue, a statue that we'll turn to next week in my other class that I'm giving at the Beaux-Arts Atelier. And this represents the artist that Micah talked about a week ago, Hiram Powers. So, as I said, the Pantheon, the first lecture. All of these monuments have also this in common, that they are embodiments of a world and a people in that world, and ultimately the relationship of that world to the larger world, the ultimate world, the true world, which of course is not as self-evident as most people, in fact all people would like it to be. And this image, I'm returning to it because not only does it show the fractured, schizophrenic, conflicted, tortured soul of France, albeit in a very elegant and serene way, through the language of the classical. But that netting that has to hover above the perimeter of this great space also is an embodiment of the largely progressive indifference of France to its quintessential representative monument. That too, so the quality of how these monuments are kept up and maintained is also very much a part of what is communicated through them. So, last week, the Chabot Cave, and we talked about very much the world that it emerged in, the world of the last ice age. Remember, ice ages, the cold part of an ice age tends to last about 100,000 years, and the warmer parts only between 10 and 15,000 years. And I emphasized reading that place in terms of the entirety of the larger world, including the world that supported the very life of its inhabitants, the flora and fauna, not just the climate. So we'll touch on that. We'll have to with our monument. And this is emblematic of the monument that we studied, a very fine image of the Lascaux cave, a similar cave and where the images are. And more recently I came across this lovely photograph from 1940, the two of the three teenagers which discovered the Lascaux cave and a number of their adults who are just captivated by what there is to be seen there. Okay, I do like this painting, so I do return to it. However, this painting is also thematic. You see a number of figures on a hill in a landscape. We're going to meet another hill. In fact, Gobeki Tepe, the Turkish name for our hill, literally means, well, it is politely translated as Potbelly Hill. I understand that's only the polite translation. They'll have to tease out what the less polite translation is. But a hill. And so what do we see on this hill? We see a story being told. The challenge of not the first, but last week's monument and today's monuments is that we have artifacts, we have no script. We have no surviving story. We have to tease out the basic outlines and fundamental content of that story. So just like as with last week, we will look at what is presented to our eyes and to our understanding through the efforts of archaeologists and other scholars to begin to tease out what all this might mean. And as with last week and the week before, context is very important. So there's our hill. There's a big hole in our hill. That hole began to appear in the mid-1960s when the first digging on this hill began. And because of what they found and as it appeared to them, they stopped digging. It seemed to be of no consequence. Now, these hills are often revealing because they are often the last trace of a human settlement. It's in the literature, it's called a tell. And the accumulated debris over the millennia eventually changes the landscape, and you have these slight moments of a larger entity on the landscape. That's how Troy was discovered. It was just another hill that Schliemann in the late 19th century decided to explore and discovered the remains of Troy. And very much like in Troy, when you begin to dig, you begin to obliterate. So recording the evidence as you're digging it, as it unfolds, is key. And this is not just a problem with Troy, but with every excavation. So they discovered this only beginning. The site was returned to in the mid-90s, and a German by the name of Klaus, I've forgotten his name, I'll remember it, Klaus Schmidt, on behalf of the Archaeological Institute, the German Archaeological Institute, which has a representative office in Ankara, got permission to re-explore this hill. So the very things that his predecessors in the mid-1960s disdained, he took a second look and went, wow, This is not what they thought it was. The reason why it was disdained in the 1960s was because of the reading of the quality of the carvings. And you'll see the carvings, and they certainly are not quite the exalted forms that we saw 2 weeks ago at the Chabot or the Lascaux caves. So they were dismissed as medieval. And the Middle Ages, I'm afraid, are the stepchild of most archaeological digs. But fortunately, when the site was returned to, a new entity was identified, and it is very much a first. So that's what the dig looks like today. This is a photograph from about a year or so ago. And a key diagnostic image of an archaeological site from the air, these squares, and digging within the squares has a lot to do with how the information is recorded as it unfolds, and then you have this mess on the right-hand side of your image, which is Artel, and this is the view. The plains of central Anatolia unfold. We're on the edge of the mountain range that is the lower southeast frame of central Anatolia. Central Anatolia is very much akin to our central plains. It is a prairie, and its climate is very much akin to our central plains. And it is a granary, just like our central plains as well. Here we see our site on a contemporary map with the borders, and from that border, and from some knowledge of recent headlines, and many of you have been following what's going on in that part of the world. It's a very dangerous place, and so it's a miracle that it hasn't been obliterated, like a lot of other places in that part of the world. And here's a drawing of what was uncovered, the central area. The red are the tall standing elements. We can call them monoliths. That's what they are. Mono, single, lith, stone. They are large vertical stones with a rectangular form. They're surrounded by some sort of wall, which also intersects with the outer ring in an enigmatic way. Then you have the blue series of walls and the yellow, and it looks like a lot was going on there. And then we zero in on the central and most interesting for most people part of this excavation. Those red bars are monoliths. And an aerial photograph closer. Shadows are beginning to be thrown. And a close-up of the previous drawing. Finally, closer yet. How many of you have seen the film 2001? Nobody? Oh, good, thank goodness. So you remember that opening scene on the moon with the monolith being excavated in the circular hole? This is our monolith, and it has an almost equal import, actually. And then seeing these three-dimensionally. These are T-shaped monoliths, and there are a lot of them. And these are just the first to be uncovered. Since we're in the center of, more or less, of this hill, possibly the earliest, but only time will tell. From the exploration of the surrounding immediate area, basically the archaeologists have determined that less than 5% of the site has been uncovered. So this is an enormous site with these T-shaped monoliths. So of course, having uncovered them and seen how unique their forms are, the archaeologists, when they eventually had enough data, tried to date it. And the dates began to fall into an absurd spectrum of time initially, and then of course they rechecked it, and the consensus is that the earliest constructions on the site date to around 10,000 BC. So this is by far the earliest evidence of monumental construction on the planet. And 10,000 BC has another significance as well. These are the first centuries following the end of the last ice age. Or rather, the recurrence of the end of the last ice age, because the last ice age didn't end very neatly. It ended, and then after a warm spell, the ice returned, and the climate's temperatures plummeted again. The ice began to move forward, and then suddenly it ended around 11,000 BC. So the core is represented by this image. So you have two standing monoliths surrounded by a double circle of smaller T-shaped monoliths. And you have these enigmatic walls which seem to both imply an enclosed space and do violence to the forms which are implied by the freestanding central monoliths, which are not enclosed. So, these forms seem to repeat several times, but they're not the only ensemble of monoliths. You have the ovals with the two central T-shaped taller pillars, and you have rectangular ones on the perimeter which have begun to be explored. We'll look at the timeline towards the end. Now, we are very much in the age of the digital. And digital models are pretty much everything, and people think digital models are really cool. Drawn three-dimensional images are also not unknown, as you'll see shortly. But this is a real model, and there's something about a real model, that plaster model, that allows you to read the forms much more spontaneously and holistically than any digital model, however comprehensive its realism might be. So there's the drawing that's based on that model, and then photographs of it. This is the representative drawing that you'll see in most publications, and in fact, Micah last Friday included it as his bridge to our talk today. And it shows, it was done for National Geographic, which produces these lovely pedagogically compelling and informative images, and it shows our site, as it were, in a series of phases. We'll zero in on parts of this drawing. But this is just to give you an introduction. Here we're zeroing in. You see in the upper right-hand part of the image, a lot of people dragging a big stone. The place where these stones were quarried, very much like Stonehenge and its stones, is not in the immediate vicinity, but close enough. It would take an enormous effort to free the stones from their bedrock, and then carve them and drag them to the site. On the opposite side of our oval, you see people working on the stone in the middle, towards the left of the center of the image. And then in the upper left, you see the stones having been raised, and then this unaccountable, or rather not very obvious wall that is filling in the perimeter of the stones. So, what kind of building is this? So, that's a big question. Is it a building? It might be a building. Some people looking at the remains, the cuttings, etc., have hypothesized, and this is a serious hypothesis, that in fact this is a building, and this is hypothesized in beams, big wooden beams, and a rational structure. This too would be phenomenal, because here we are, 10,000 BC, and we have an elaborate, very rational roof. And it remains a question. There is really no consensus on this point. There are the building people, and then there are the other people who read the monument in a very different way. So this is a digital section, another model, showing what the building might have looked like, its construction, and this is an attempt to account for the fill that was found as they were excavating these monoliths, because these monoliths seem to have been deliberately buried or maybe accidentally buried from the eventual collapse of one of these roofs, because eventually, of course, the wood will rot and this whole pile of stuff will fall in. Now, it's not an implausible hypothesis. Here we have a Neolithic dwelling from England, and sometimes these are called barrows when they are tombs, and they often are tombs. But they were also residences in the Paleolithic, and any of you who have pioneer ancestors in this part of the world, or it's certainly true in central Canada or in the prairie, when they first arrived, they did build log cabins. They built things that very much looked like this. The roofs were covered with turf, and they were partially buried into the ground. This is a very old way of building in a cold and hostile world. So, bracket all of this. This is one hypothesis. The other hypothesis is that these entities, these monoliths in these particular forms are open to the sky. So you have the earth people and the sky people. That's basically how the reading of this monument has bifurcated. And the evidence is ambiguous, as I said. But whether earth people or sky people, these two central monoliths seem to be clearly quite distinct, not merely in size, but in their ornament. So in the heart of this drawing, the artist has shown what seem to be totems made of animal skins and some kind of offerings, and they're reading it as some kind of aniconic, non-iconic, or sort of generic quasi-iconic image, therefore a manifestation of some sort of sacred. And there's no doubt that there's also a formal entrance with sculptural forms, like two sphinxes back to back. Rather alarming looking, scary sphinxes. But sphinxes are supposed to be scary anyways, with a lintel in between. So, the sky people have had a field day with their monument over the last 20 years or so. And so, this is one reading of the position of the stones. Of course, the same sky people read those not completely dissimilar stones in England, which we call Stonehenge, a henge of stones, and therefore read it as either a calendar or a star chart, and having some potential astrological-like image of constellations or months. And we should take this possibility quite seriously. We simply don't know. And sadly, as is usual, the archaeologists when they find something really spectacular, it's hard to restrain yourself. It's hard to do the due diligence and carefully peel away the remains and record them. You dig a little bit too quickly. The dig, as I said, started in the 1960s and was abandoned. And when it started again, it was already very disturbed, the center. And so whether what filled the spaces between these monoliths was deliberately laid or the result of a collapse of a massive earthen roof above very heavy logs of considerable size remains a mystery. We just don't know. That's the consensus of the archaeologists in the most recent article that I read from about a year ago. We don't know. That's very frustrating, right? We just don't know. It's a mystery, it's an enigma, and we're only half an hour into the talk, so what are we going to do with this enigma? Well, we're going to look a little bit more closely at it. Archaeological sites really only look decent when the site is fresh and people are digging and dusting. And eventually you'll see images of the site where these monoliths have been blocked in with wooden crates and grasses begin to grow and the sides of the trenches have begun to cave in and doesn't look quite as charming and riveting as this one. This is from the publication of the archaeologists themselves, the German Institute, and Germans are pretty good at due diligence when it comes to things like this. So, looking a little bit more closely at eye level, it's a classic messy archaeological site. Notice the difference between already we can see the walls which fill in the spaces of the outer perimeter of the oval and kind of double oval, and the monoliths themselves. The monoliths are remarkably rectangular. Okay, so briefly, in terms of larger chronology, the last ice age ended roughly around 12,000 years ago, 13,000 years ago. And agriculture and the domestication of animals begins roughly around the same time as the end of the Ice Age, maybe a couple of hundred years plus or minus. And so we call the period after the end of the last Ice Age the Neolithic, i.e. the New Stone Age, because human beings are still using stone tools. The centuries just before that are often called terminal Neolithic. It sounds like a disease. It simply means terminal Paleolithic simply means the end of the old Stone Age. So the difference in human terms between the old Stone Age and the New Stone Age, and the defining characteristic of the Neolithic is the invention, the discovery, the beginning of what we know as farming, i.e. settled settlements where food is produced more locally, whereas previously people were hunter-gatherers migrating with the animals which sustained them. So, this is a huge transition, and what is astonishing about these remains, to all the people who could begin to think seriously about them and study them, is they are closer in time to the Paleolithic hunter-gatherers than to the Neolithic farmers. In fact, there's no evidence, I haven't said this yet, of habitation. There's no evidence of people living here. There's no evidence of settlements and the soundings in the immediate vicinity of this monument, but again, since we've only excavated about 5%, hard to tell. However, not just these strange T-shaped forms, and the vertical form supports a horizontal form which is formally slightly distinct from it, as you can tell, and you have a wolf-like creature carved in low relief on the stone. Now, this kind of carving is much harder to do than the standard relief where you're carving into the surface of the stone. What they've done is they've carved the form of the animal and then dressed the stone down to create a flat field so that the form of the animal comes forward from the plane in which it is embedded. Very hard to do. So these people have made life more difficult for themselves, and they've created these well-formed surfaces. And then the two vertical stones have an even greater mystery. You have what looks like a belt around the center of the stone. Above it you have two hands which seem to be holding a tummy above the belt. And then you have a vertical groove immediately above. And you have what is a pelt that seems to be hanging from the belt, very much in the manner of the ancient Egyptian pharaohs with their kilts. Now, the surrounding stones, some of them are very elaborately carved with a superimposition of many images. These are the things which were initially encountered at the topmost layers in the 1960s, and people thought they were primitive medieval carvings, so that's what led them to abandon the excavation, and, well, they may be kind of primitive looking to us, but they're hardly medieval, as it turned out. So, they're not all zoomorphic, i.e. the forms of animals. Some of them look like suitcases, hard to tell what those are. And a ground against which these duck-like creatures, a boar beneath them, and what looks like fabric above the central carving. And you have dangerous felines. There were still dangerous felines lurking at the end of the last ice age. We know them as saber-toothed tigers. They were not tigers, but they definitely had saber-like teeth. Most of the animals seem to be predators that are represented in these carvings. There are scorpions, there are snakes, there are wolves, there are lions, and of course, doing their due diligence, archaeologists have carefully recorded each one of these stones, and in the specialized publications in German over the last 20 years, they have steadily appeared. You have the occasional bovine and the duck. I don't think the duck's a predator, so don't know what to make of that. Zeroing in on drawings of some of these carvings. And there are replicas in museums in Turkey of this ensemble. Of course, they're going to be, because you can't have tourists mucking about on an archaeological site. I remember how Lascaux was destroyed by tourism. But people are very curious, so very much like the Chauveau Cave with its replicas of the painted walls. You have replicas of these standing stones that people can visit. The most alarming of these carvings is a virtual three-dimensional animal climbing down the vertical face of this monolith. A little scary. Fox, wolverine, they're not sure. And this may or may not be a dog or a wolf. On our central standing stone, there you see the belt. And there we see the upper portions of this, whatever it is that has a hand at the end. When you see it in this context, you see that it's a very elongated, stylized arm. And some people who publish, or rather present movies on the History Channel, I'm sure we're going to have the aliens' interpretation of this image. If it hasn't already appeared, it's going to appear. Come on, if the aliens built the Sphinx and the pyramids, this is a sure candidate. Okay, now I'm being a little ironic, obviously. So, let's look at it more closely. This is a digital scan. I wasn't able to find any drawings. The book, I actually have a couple of journals and 2 books on this monument, but they're in storage in New York, so I had to rely entirely on what I could find online. This is a careful digital model, which shows the position of this animal, the arms. There is no head. So the T part, the horizontal of our T-shaped monolith, is in the space of the head, and you have the girdle, and you have the loincloth. That's what it looks like head on. And you have this vertical groove along the front. Not only that, the base that our monument sits on has a bunch of ducks, or duck-like creatures. There are ducks around here. I've seen ducks in South Jordan. Okay, that scaffolding that you see like a neck at the top of the monument isn't to keep it together. It's for the formwork for when at the end of the excavation season they embed the monument in a kind of giant crate so that the vertical wooden elements do not damage the surface of the monument, and they're very much afraid of vandalism, as they have to be in this part of the world. Okay, here's the real shocker. Just a few miles away, not very far away at all, the oldest standing statue of a human being was found that is contemporary with our monument. This is a 6 foot, slightly taller statue. Orpha, it's called the Orpha Man, and so it is contemporary with the oldest phase of Gobeki, Tepe. All previous statues are basically fist-sized or smaller, going back to around 35,000 years ago to around 10,000 years ago. So this is the first freestanding statue. And notice how the hands are positioned. So clearly, those monoliths are abstracted versions of two human beings surrounded by other T-shaped, quasi-abstracted human beings covered with a kind of low-relief tattooing on their surfaces. Okay, at this point we have to suspect that this is not just a residence or utilitarian in its purposes. So, stepping back, seeing them in their context, the outer rings, as I said, not the central ring, seem to mimic the central ring. Here you see one of the outer rings, outer ovals, rather, not rings, immediately adjacent to it in the process of being constructed. From the evidence of the remains, the original hypothesis was that after a while the central oval was abandoned, and so this was, as I said, the earliest thoughts, and then buried, and then a new ring was started. And this may still be the narrative, we just don't know. So, either way, the iconography and the unique forms suggest at least one particular form which in being repeated is reenacted, and whatever the content of the reenactment is, you have a real evidence for a cultural continuity. Okay, the other shocker is that this site has been returned to, and these things have been built or rebuilt or reenacted over a period of about 2,500 years. So, a very stable culture, which is returning again and again and doing whatever is of central significance, and then going away, and then returning, and then going away, and then returning, and then going away. Now, this is a drawing which hypothesizes what the partial half circles dug into the ground might represent, and they might represent places for temporary tent-like structures which are set up when people return here. There's plenty of archaeological evidence for massive feasts going on. So these may be the banqueting houses for the feasts, when the people who created the place and returned to it enact their rituals. So, context. We're going to step back in time and look at a similar looking oval structure from further north on the other side of the Black Sea, as it's called today, and it might give us something of a beginning frame of reference. I only found one drawing trying to animate these structures from the inside. This was not an archaeologist doing this, but a gifted graphic novelist. And, well, I wish more people would take up the challenge. Okay, third shocker. It's not unique to the area. Smaller versions of these T-shaped vertical stones have been found in this corner of southeastern Turkey. So each one of the T's represents another site. They're not as monumental and not as extensive as the central one. So it does seem that like we found the central, and I'll call it a shrine now, and then it produced these perimeter ones for a people that inhabited this part of the Anatolian plain for many, many centuries, almost as long as the Egyptians and their civilization in the Nile Valley. Okay, another drawing which shows these T-shaped monuments, and then the dots represent some of the earliest village-like settlements which occur later in time. So, as we step back from our hill and this beautifully, hardly anybody in it, archaeological site, we have to ask ourselves what is obviously the climate of the time. And so this is an emblematic drawing which shows or rather it is a drawing which in short, kind of iconic hieroglyphic shorthand form shows vegetation and climate in Anatolia at the end of the last ice age. It was not what it is today. There was a drastic dry period followed by a wet period and the beginning of lush vegetation at the same time as our monument was built. And this is a diagrammatic map which shows the dating of the earliest evidence for the domestication of animals emerging out of our area. Notice that our area is in the center of the overlap of 3 of these 4 circles. Okay, we're getting closer to the significance of this area. So about 1,000 years later, you have what used to be thought the earliest evidence, decades and decades ago, for the beginning of the Neolithic in the area of today's Jordan, Israel, and the Lebanon. And then the lower Tigris-Euphrates Valley. It's not a very exciting looking plain, but from the evidence, the archaeological evidence, it was a lush, partially forested kind of prairie 12,000 years ago. Okay. Now the fourth shocker, and now we go to the plant people who study grains, is that the Ur grain, the ancestor of our wheat and barley, genetically studied, appears to have been, its roots seem to be in this area of southeastern Turkey. So that is clear evidence that at the time that these monuments are being built, somewhere in this area people are beginning to cultivate grain and beginning to plant it and to harvest it. And so this monument, and this is one of the more confident conclusions about our monument, is in the place where the Neolithic really does begin. But the monuments precede settlements and settled farming. So we're dealing with a nomadic migrating people, which is beginning to experiment with farming, but still they go away, they travel with their herds, and then they come back. But somebody is returning, and the grain is becoming more genetically specialized. So, okay, bracket all that. Now we're going to go further north and revisit our old friends, the woolly mammoths, and these great herds with their hunter-gatherer members on the perimeter and intrinsic parts of the great herds. So, at about the same time as people were digging in this hill and abandoning it, in the Ukraine, again in the mid-60s, a farmer trying to expand his basement came across a huge woolly mammoth tusk, and because it was Soviet Russia, he reported it because he otherwise could end up really in a bad place if he was beginning to peddle ancient ivory. The archaeologists from Moscow showed up and discovered a gigantic pile of mammoth bones, and not one but several. So, we are now looking at basically just hundreds of years before our oval of monoliths, or ovals of monoliths. And one of the great mysteries pertaining to the woolly mammoths and their end is whether or not people were responsible for the extinction of the great mammoth herds, whether it was climate or some combination of the two. I love this image, even though it's a digital image, because it shows the problem of people as individuals trying to hunt woolly mammoths. First of all, yeah, you can throw that spear, even with the accelerator, at a woolly mammoth, but it's got at least 2 feet of wool between the spear and its flesh. Hard to get through that. And then there are those tusks, and they're not stupid animals. They know how to use those tusks. They flick away saber-toothed tigers and giant bears. They can deal with puny little human beings. Now, there are ways to get around that, of course, and I'll leave that to your imagination. This pile of mammoth bones turned out to be a huge construction, a kind of igloo-like form that really is, chronologically speaking, so we're 1,500 years before our monoliths in southern Turkey, to be the earliest freestanding monumental human constructions. This is one of these, and quite a few of them have been found now, certainly more than 10. They've been found in Southeast Europe, in the Ukraine, in the Crimea, and I think 1 or 2 in the Caucasus as well. So, within the old Soviet sphere. They're nothing to do with the Soviets, of course. So are they huts? Are they the first huts? Are they the first houses? Are they the first constructions? Well, the temptation to surrender to that hypothesis is enormously strong. So you have these Russian, or rather Soviet, drawings of how they imagine these huts were inhabited. A lot like our ovals in southeastern Turkey. They occur in groups of 2 or 3. And the evidence is certainly that people lived there for a while, because we have evidence of the remains of animals that have been carved up and eaten. We have fires. And so, at least for a brief stretch, this seems to be not completely unreasonable. I find these pelts thrown over them rather pathetic. They don't look like a very serious attempt to insulate. I don't know that there's any evidence of a wooden superstructure for them. So this is from another museum, a diorama, and these are not replica mammoth bones. These are actual mammoth bones. that have been used for these dioramas. Okay, let's go forward in time. Throughout Central Asia, the standard form of dwelling until recent times, and in Mongolia, and in southern Siberia, parts of southern Siberia, in Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, the yurt is still a viable form of dwelling. This is a lovely photograph from the late 19th century, a very early photograph from an ethnographic study funded by the imperial government, showing a yurt inhabited by its local family. So, the form of the contemporary yurt is a magical creation of ingenuity where lots of little sticks are, as it were, woven together to create a framework over which you throw the pulverized wool of your sheep and goats to create felt, and it is a fantastically efficient insulator. In Russia, people who are serious about winter wear felt boots. They don't wear leather boots or boots made of some artificial material, and people with felt boots do not get frostbite. So they live in felt-covered houses, which can be, I'm told, thrown together, or I read, thrown together in about 2 hours. So, ideal for nomadic people. And the peoples of Central Asia have been nomadic for basically from the last ice age and before. This is from a diorama in New York City, the Museum of Natural History, treating our mammoth bone igloo-like structure as if it was a residence. So guess what the obvious problem with this hypothesis is? Well, they're not farmers. They're not no domesticated pigs and goats and sheep. They're moving with the great herds. It's not possible that people are residing here, least of all in the middle of winter. We're in the pre-pottery age. There's no ability to preserve food, to dry food, to store it. The only way you can survive is by fresh game. So, this is not reasonable. Okay, fortunately, we have this image. So guess what? In the center of this particular hut was found the skull of a woolly mammoth. And on the skull was incised this very enigmatic assemblage of lines and dots. So I didn't show any of this last week or 2 weeks ago, but alongside the figural iconography of these Paleolithic caves in southern France and northern Spain and in parts of Germany, in Central Europe. Do you need a break, or can we just forge on to the end? Because I'm about two-thirds of the way through. Do you want a break? No? Okay, so we'll go through to the end. Okay, not only was this a very iconic skull, but it turned out to be a drum. In other words, the top was hollowed out so that a skin could be placed over it, so that you could make musical sounds on it. So the odds are this is some sort of shrine, right? We're not going to think of it just as a residence. Not only that, but there's way more than one woolly mammoth that has contributed to each one of these huts. In one group, one of the earliest groups of 3 or 4, at least 150 pieces of woolly mammoths contributed to these huts. So if they're hunting them, they're sure hunting them to extinction. Here's a diagram showing how they're constructed. So it is a kind of vault or dome, obviously. The principle is corbelling, but they do seem to use the tusks also as reinforcing. Think about the effort that goes into this. The other reason why you wouldn't really do this if you were merely hunter-gatherers and migrating people is these larger bones weigh several hundred pounds. So it requires a group of people moving them around, and then think about how do you then pile them up on top of one another. So, like Gobeki Tepe in southeastern Turkey, each one of these huts is a product of an enormous amount of effort that would be simply irrational if you were a nomad trying to use local materials to build a shelter for yourself. The first ones that were found by this farmer digging in his basement on the shores of one of Russia's great rivers. Here's a photograph in the mid-60s of one of these ensembles being excavated. There you see the gentleman's house, Mr. Novitsky, and around his house were found the remains of 4 of these. So these were the earliest. The diagram shows the different assemblages of various other debris that were associated with it. Here we see the collapsed mammoth hut as it's being excavated. There we have the Soviet archaeologists in their due diligence carefully drawing and identifying each bone so that it turned out not to be a random pile of mammoth debris, but a construction. And it was certainly clear once the dirt was beginning to be dusted away that there was something super deliberate about this. Here's an early publication, from a Soviet publication, showing, you see the 2 ones in the Crimea, the group in the Caucasus, and then the first one was found near Kiev in the Ukraine. Okay, now, geography was changing there too. As the ice was beginning to retreat, a huge sea occupied the area of the later Caspian Sea. It was just to make the point about the changing climate, the geography, the great rivers that were carved through the landscape from the melting glaciers, and its relationship to Turkey, just on the other side of the Black Sea. So could it be that our people who are beginning to domesticate the grain, the grasses, and turn them into wheat, etc., are the same people who built these mammoth huts? We don't know. Another drawing showing, calling them houses, charming, and again, in the middle of winter, I don't think you'd be inhabiting them. They don't look like they're very well insulated in these drawings, so just a little bit of self-reflection would have caused you to pause. Here's another overview from this hypothesis from the Natural History Museum in New York. This is quite a nice diorama. What I like about it is the way our gentleman is dressed in his late Paleolithic garb. And here's a drawing with a rather inadequate curtain to create an enclosure. And back to the photograph with the skull. So, the problem, just like, very much like with our remains in southeastern Turkey, the big question is, what is the relationship between these, what look like cemeteries of woolly mammoths with literally hundreds of individuals' bones, and these dwellings? What I like about this drawing is it gives you a much more probable image of what the actual dwellings of this nomadic people, whether they hunted the mammoth or not, looked like. Now, from the remains around these mammoth constructions, it would appear that certainly they were burning some of the mammoth bones for fuel, so they were consuming parts of the mammoth. But it is a completely open question whether what they're doing is they're mining the remains of the cemeteries of mammoths, or these are the killing fields for vast herds of mammoths. I can't give you an answer. This remains to be figured out by experts in the field. So let's say farewell. Actually, we may not be really saying farewell to a mammoth. The cutting edge of what is fictionally presented in films like Jurassic Park and the sequels rather, is a very serious effort to bring back as a living creature the woolly mammoth. Now, unlike these dinosaurs with their fictitious pieces of DNA trapped in amber, which really doesn't work, our woolly mammoths, such as they've been uncovered, have been encased in ice and fairly well-preserved strands of pieces of DNA have been uncovered in them, and certainly a lot of flesh and fur, and actually people in Siberia used to eat this stuff in previous centuries when they'd come across woolly mammoth partially melting in the permafrost and ice, so we may yet see them return. And there's a serious ecological reason for it, because as the climate warms, the greatest danger in an explosion of carbon dioxide is the permafrost in northern Canada and in Siberia, which in its frozen vegetation traps a large percentage of the carbon dioxide. So were that vegetation to begin to rot in great quantities, a vast amount of carbon dioxide would be expelled in the atmosphere, much more than the puny amount that we're producing in our factories, etc. So the idea is to recreate these Paleolithic herds and have them migrate back and forth across the north, because the problem with the melting permafrost is too much snow. And what the snow does is it actually warms up the ground below it by creating a kind of insulation. So, strange twists in our common story. Is there a relationship between any of this and Stonehenge? Well, first of all, we tend to think of Stonehenge as really, really old. And it is old. It was pretty old when that's all we knew. The Stonehenge seems to begin around 3000 BC. Well, what's 3000 BC when we're talking about 10,000 BC, right? Not only that, but the standing stones themselves are only as old as the Great Pyramids. So they're contemporaries with the Great Pyramids. This is not to denigrate Stonehenge. Stonehenge is fantastically interesting. And as more and more archaeology has been done directly in Stonehenge and in the surrounding areas, this is a very useful digital model. The monoliths are all shown blue. The holes represent what were the negative of standing wooden structures, and the red shows the orientation, true north, south, east, west. And as those of you who might have heard this, because it reappears again and again every equinox and solstice, it's somehow you can read the changing of the seasons from the center. But it turns out Stonehenge is also a vast cemetery. And there is this monumental avenue which has been uncovered that leads to another vast circle that seems to be the place for a camp of the living in relation to the camp of the dead, which is Stonehenge. And one of the hypotheses about these monoliths and these platforms is that very much like the Zoroastrians, the Farsi, the old Persians, they may have exposed their dead, let them be picked by the birds on the top of these monoliths, and then buried the bones in the tombs that have been found around them. So, pyramids, just a glance at the pyramids, and the sky. So we have to give the sky people a little bit of leeway with our standing stones, because certainly the magic of the skies has captivated many peoples, and perhaps they captivated our people. And again, this is a very useful image. I've superimposed two in the upper right-hand corner. we see a reconstruction, albeit digital, of what the pyramids really looked like when they were new. The tops were gold. They reflected light, like in a blinding fashion in the Egyptian sunlight. The sides were polished with the Egyptian equivalent of marble, which would have made them blinding. And there were lots of them. And they are clustered around the settlement in the center of this drawing, which is the site of the northern capital of Egypt, Memphis, from which your local city gains its name. Okay, the oldest monumental stone constructions before our site was found were previously believed to be these enigmatic probable temples in the middle of the Mediterranean in Malta. There's a photograph of probably the cult sacred area of one of them, and here is an aerial shot of another. About 6 or 7 of them have been found on Malta, and these are a little bit older than Stonehenge. And they just erupt in the middle of the Mediterranean on a rather small island. Another mystery, we again know very little. Unfortunately, they were uncovered way before the science of archaeology was underway, so we just have what we see with very little other archaeological evidence. Here, it's a little hard to read, but starting with our monument at the far left of the image, we go forward over the centuries to the pyramids, which are at the far right of the image, and then you have Stonehenge. But Egypt didn't really begin with the pyramids, so 1, 2, 3, 4. The 5th dot shows a circle of stones in the side of the Nile Valley that goes back to 7,000 BC. So whatever gives us Egypt eventually began many thousands of years before our well-known Old Kingdom Egypt and its successors. Okay, back to our climate. The last eruption, the last ice age, didn't want to leave very gracefully, so after temperatures began to warm up, they plummeted again. This is a diagram taken from ice cores in Greenland, which show the up and down of the temperatures on our planet. And what is interesting, and so that just at the point where things are beginning to warm up, and I can't really point to it because I don't have a way of pointing at my screen and it appearing over there. But so this is thousands of years from the present. So go back to not 10,000 years ago, but 12,000 years ago, and go a little forward, and that coincides exactly with the first monoliths in their ovals, in their concentric ovals at Gobeki, Tepe. So, at the point where there was a dramatic climate change, when climate began to warm up, when vegetation began to erupt all over Anatolia, when the great prairies began to be well watered, is when our people began to settle down and began to domesticate sheep, goats, cattle, and begin to found the rudiments of farming. Okay, another first, well, maybe a first, certainly the earliest. About 100 miles due west is another well-known Turkish site, very old. This used to be a first for a while. Çatalhöyük is the oldest known human village. And it is a village on the side of a river. This is really quite a fine digital reconstruction based on very good archaeology, because from the mid 20th century, many decades of international and Turkish archaeologists have carefully excavated Çatalhöyük. I've actually been there on one of our field trips from the American School of classical studies, and the person who guided us had actually dug there, and he was the secretary of the school. So we got to see it in great detail and look at the remains. It was inhabited, it also, for about 2,000 years, from around 7,500 BC to 5,700 BC. Now, think about this. You've got a bunch of people living in the same place, building and rebuilding over 2,000 years. This is the end of the first phase of the Neolithic and the threshold of the Chalcolithic, which is the beginning of metallurgy, i.e. the Copper Age, and also the Age of Pottery. These guys, these dwellings, are certainly dwellings, and they're fascinating. Here's a close-up, another image. What is truly fascinating about them is there are no corridors, and there is no ground entry into them. You entered into them from the top. The roofs were the streets. There were courtyards, but they didn't open onto courtyards. That's a plan. So you have a bunch of rooms that you come in from the top. And it is clear from the remains that if not everyone, certainly the majority of these rooms were also sanctuaries. There's a nice full-scale reconstruction that I'll show you in a moment. And they're also multi-story as well. So the lower stories, some of them, the lower stories would have been rather dark. They would have been lit from the top. And here's a reconstructed room. Your basic bachelor pad with some skulls of bovines and some kind of sculptural motif above. This could be a hipster pad in Williamsburg, New York almost. I'm actually only slightly exaggerating. Anyhow, rooms in New York really are this small. It's hard to afford, even with a generous salary, to live there now. Okay. The foundations of these buildings are founded on human burials, which hopefully were not sacrificed human beings, but maybe ancestors. And the inhabitants were buried under the floor, it would appear. So lots of dead people as a part of this dig. Okay. This is a satellite photo that shows the Çatalhöyük, Gobeki Tepe, and Jericho. As I mentioned earlier, there's also a Neolithic settlement that I've also been to on Cyprus. So after Çatalhöyük, the next two oldest were the foundations of the settlement at Jericho and this settlement in Cyprus. Again, each one of them inhabited continuously for thousands of years. So, these overlapping ovals again chart the phases of the early to middle Neolithic. Now, those of you who have a good grasp of the Old Testament, certainly the beginning, Genesis, might remember, at least in terms of a kind of geographic location for the Garden of Eden. Where's the Garden of Eden supposed to be? Before we get there. This is a beautiful painting from Russia from 1881 by a very great Russian painter who mostly painted country life, Vasily Maximov, Vasily Maximov, entitled The Sick Husband, and I included it to show dwellings that were, even into historical times and still in many places on the planet, a room where everybody lived in the same room, and the sacred was most emphatically manifest in the room as well. So you have the icon corner the sick husband on his bed, hopefully not his deathbed, and his wife fervently praying towards the icon corner. And icons in the Orthodox world are always on the eastern side of the room, so praying in the direction of the east. So, in the Old Testament, Eden is said to be at the confluence of 4 great rivers. Now, Gobeki Tepe is in the confluence of at least 2 very great rivers, the Tigris and the Euphrates, and a number of other rivers emerging from there as well. I'm not saying it's Eden. That's not the point of this image. The point of this image is to expand the frame of reference even further. Couldn't possibly be Eden because Adam and Eve are the parents of all of us, not just of the Neolithic. So they would have to be chronologically thrown back at least 200 to 300,000 years BC, and not merely 10,000 years BC. But certainly this part of southeastern Turkey is manifestly a real beginning for many of the things that we take for granted and that we still depend on, like farming. Whether you're a vegetarian or a meat eater, we all depend on farming, no matter how many magical machines Apple and their competitors come up with. I began with this image. It's a painting by Joseph Michael Candy. It's called Architecture from its Natural Mode, or its Natural Beginnings. So, the big subject remains architecture. So far, I have shown you evidence that certainly the beginnings of architecture are not merely utilitarian, but rather, first and foremost, it seems that at the root of all known architectures, first of all, is the sacred. Okay, to be continued. Next 2 weeks from now, I'll be talking about a city as a temple, a city in the central part of the Nile Valley that is not completely unfamiliar, but certainly it is not usually understood that the whole city is a temple rather than a city with temples. Any questions? Okay.
Is there any discussion about the discrepancy between those huge monolithic stones and the cobblestone walls around it?
That, so far, what seems I talked about it in a way that you were supposed to ask that question. It seems like it is probable, because of the way the outer ring is embedded in they're not small stones, they're like big, heavy stones, but not the same quality as the monoliths. It would appear that originally the monoliths were freestanding. And then they were embedded in those circles. And so perhaps the original reading is correct, that then when they were taken out of service, as it were, they were buried, and a new oval circle was started next to them. That would account for the 2,000 years. So, but the reading of the material evidence, at least as it's available to me online, suggests that that's a line that the current Germans have given up, and they're trying to think of it as collapsed mounds. So we don't know. Time will tell. There are many more to be excavated, and hopefully more carefully than the first 2 or 3. So we shall see. I did call this an enigma, after all, in my title. There are many aspects to the enigma, more obvious and less obvious. The next talk, too, is going to be an enigma, but an Egyptian enigma. So because we have writing, there'll be more stories to tell from the times of that enigma. Here we just have to speculate. Not completely arbitrary. That's why I included the other places to establish a frame of reference for Gobeki Tepe. No. Any other questions? If not, until next time, thank you very much.